Be still and know that I am God. Welcome to today's selected study topic from the Bible.
Welcome to our lesson. We'll be looking at a new series called God's Love for Man. David, the sweet psalmist of Israel, was an observer of God's creation. He was a shepherd. He grew up as a young man watching sheep, and clearly this psalm, if you read through it, it's only 8 we will look at. He was out at night. He'd be able to look at the sky and marvel at God's creation. And he wondered at the beauty as he looked at that night sky. And it caused him to wonder, him as a sinner, knowing that he was, wondering why God chose to love man as he did. If you look at Psalm 8, and I use the King James Version, it's just what I've been used to for many, many years. You may look it up in other verses, and in my notes you can find them in the link below if you want to see the text of this, and you can look it up in a version you may be more comfortable with. It says here, he wrote in Psalm 8, verses 3 and 4, "When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou visitest him?" Any one of us who is a true student of Scripture will have the same awe and love of God as David did. The love of God for man is just an amazing thing as we look in the pages of Scripture. As we study divine revelation, God shows how great this love and care for man is. And we can ask, just as David asked, why is it so? Although I don't think we can ever really fully discover the depth of this, it sure is a blessing to get into the pages of Scripture and explore the love of God that he has for this race of man that he has created. Now let's go back right to the beginning of time, and we're going to find that in the book of Genesis. Genesis 1:1, we can look right there. We have here the origins of the physical world, and it's no mystery. God has clearly revealed to us how all things came to be. The first 3 words of the Bible states, "In the beginning." Interesting words here. Therefore, if we think of these words, time as we know it has not always existed. It came into existence at a time. And we see that when it happened, when that clock started ticking, we see that there was somebody already there. When it began, someone always existed. And the 4th word of Revelation, Genesis 1:1 tells us who that is. In the beginning, God. Before time was, he is. And he was there, and he did something as time began. The 5th word of the Bible tells us what that is. In the beginning, God created. The Scriptures then unfolds the true revelation of how all things, including man, came into being. For God created the heavens and the earth, and this was all done by the power of his spoken word. It says in Genesis 1:1, again we'll read that, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. With these words he called into existence the beginning of all things. Now this is both visible and invisible. While the remainder of the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 1 and into chapter 2, the sacred record unfolds the record of the progress of God's creation of the physical world. But at the same time, although not all totally given us here, we find that God created the things which the eye cannot see, and those things which I will call the invisible world. We know from the other parts of Scripture that the eternal Son was the divine agent of the creation. And we can see that in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, and Colossians chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. The eternal Son created through his action. He brought forth, and it says in Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, all things created that are in heaven and that are in the earth. He brought them into existence. And at the same passage tells us that those things included both the visible and the invisible. All things were created by him, both visible and invisible. Thus the heavenly realms with the angelic host would have been created at the same time in creation by the commands of the eternal Son as the visible creation came into existence, as is recorded in Genesis 1 and 2. As the record of creation of the visible world progressed, God said, "Let there be light." That's in Genesis 1:3. And the result is instantly, as he commanded, there was light. He divided the light from the darkness and called this the first day. And from this first day, God moved on into form and filled the earth as he desired. He placed water where he chose, and he brought dry land upon the face of the earth. And as the creation account unfolds, in Genesis chapter 1, a formula develops, and we can observe this. And he would say, as for example, I'm going to look at verse 11 of chapter 1 of Genesis. "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herbs yielding seed, and the fruit trees yielding fruit after their kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth." And the response of this, as you finish the verse, "It was so." And the response, and we see in verse 14, God called lights in the heavens, and it was so. Verses 20 and 21, God called the waters to bring forth living creatures, and for birds to fly in the open expanse. The result of this, of his spoken word, was that it happened just as he said. And this, he said, it was good. When God called cattle and other living creatures into the earth, the result was it was so. And all was made at the time all that was made up to this time had come into existence by the same formula. God spoke, and it was so. Some thoughts and conclusions for this lesson. The Bible clearly reveals the origin of all things. It is from and by God's creative power. God called everything to existence by his word. Number 2, the creation period brought into existence both the physical world and the heavenly, or the invisible world. 3, with the unfolding truth of the doctrine of the Trinity, we learn that creation came into existence through the eternal Son. Again, we saw that in in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, and Colossians 1, 16 and 17. And point 4, God, who existed before time as we know it began, was able to call all things into existence by the power of his spoken word. A fifth thing we can consider here, although God called all things into existence by his spoken word, we're going to see as these lessons progress how he brought man into existence, and it was done personally and lovingly, differently from the rest of the creation. We will see that the way in which God created man sets man in a unique position in all God's creation.